Storms have a way of finding quiet places. River Hollow Road is one of those places, an old stretch of two-lane road that runs along the Hudson Valley in upstate New York. On most days, it's silent. The kind of silence that reminds you how far you are from everything. But on the night of May 14, 1998, that silence broke. Not with wind. Not with thunder. But with the sound of a voice, coming through a radio that shouldn't have been working. This is the story of Robert and Ellen Hayes, a couple who just wanted a quiet retirement by the river. What happened in their cabin that night still remains unexplained. Robert was a retired postal worker. Practical man. The kind who never wasted words. Ellen, his wife, had been a school librarian for 30 years. Gentle voice, steady hands. They'd bought the cabin 3 years earlier, small, 2 rooms, wood stove, a screened porch that looked out over the river. It wasn't fancy, but they called it home. That evening, the rain started early. Robert was reading by the fire, Ellen was making tea, and the local weather station was warning of a severe thunderstorm rolling east from Albany. By 8:30, the first flash of lightning hit the ridge behind the cabin. Robert looked out through the window and said, "We might lose power." Ellen just smiled, she'd already lit the candles. Nothing unusual. Just another storm in upstate New York. Until the lights flickered, and went completely out. Robert reached for the flashlight they kept by the door. The radio on the shelf, an old battery model from the 70s, began to hiss with static. He thought maybe it picked up a signal from the weather station. But what came through next wasn't a forecast. It was a voice. Clear. Calm. Female. And it said, "Robert and Ellen Hayes. Please take shelter." Robert froze. Ellen asked what he'd heard. He told her, and she laughed nervously. Said it must have been a coincidence, just names, that's all. But Robert wasn't so sure. They tried turning the dial, but the voice came back. This time, softer. Like someone whispering through the interference. Robert switched it off completely, but even after the radio went silent, Ellen swore she could still hear that same voice, faint, under the sound of the rain. She said it sounded like it was coming from outside. Robert went to check the porch, but the screen door was moving, back and forth, even though the wind wasn't that strong. He closed it tight and locked it. When he turned around, the radio, the one he'd switched off, came back on again. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the front door. Not a gentle one. Sharp. 3 times. Robert called out, asked who it was. No answer. He waited, then opened the door just enough to look outside. Nobody was there. But when he looked down, there were wet footprints on the porch. Bare feet. They led up to the door, and stopped. He shut it fast. Locked it. Turned around, and that's when Ellen saw them. Muddy footprints. Inside the living room. Not from boots, not from shoes. They started near the front door, and ended right beside the chair Robert had been sitting in. Ellen said she wanted to leave. Robert told her it was just the storm, maybe someone seeking shelter. But he couldn't explain how the prints led inside when the door hadn't been opened. The lights flickered again, for just a moment, and Ellen thought she saw someone standing by the window. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. The storm reached its peak around 11:15. Rain coming down so hard, it sounded like gravel hitting the roof. Every flash of lightning lit up the yard like daylight, for just a second. Robert stood by the window, looking out toward the trees. That's when he saw it. A man. Standing by the riverbank. Soaked. Still. Just standing there in the downpour. The figure was wearing a rain jacket, the same one Robert had been wearing earlier that evening. Same build. Same posture. For a moment, he thought it was a reflection, but the man outside moved when he didn't. Ellen called his name, and he turned to answer her. When he looked back out the window, the man was gone. A second later, there was a loud crack of thunder, and all the candles blew out. Robert ran for the matches, and as the room filled with the smell of smoke, Ellen whispered, "Robert, he's at the door." Robert turned, and through the lightning's glare, he saw the shape of a man standing outside the glass door. Same face. Same clothes. He didn't move. Didn't knock. Just stood there, staring through the glass as water streamed down his face. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm quieted. No more thunder. No rain. Just the hum of the fridge coming back to life. When Robert opened the door, the man was gone. Only one thing remained, his own wet footprints leading away from the porch, down toward the river. By morning, the storm had passed. The air smelled of wet pine and river mud. Robert and Ellen didn't sleep that night. They packed a few things, said they'd go into town. But before leaving, Robert went to check the riverbank. That's when he saw it, about 100 yards downstream, half hidden in the trees. Another cabin. Burned. Collapsed. Looked abandoned for years. Police said lightning must have hit it during the storm. But when they went inside, they found two bodies, a man and a woman, seated by what used to be a fireplace. Old, unrecognizable, except for the metal name tags melted into the table beside them. One read, Robert. The other, Ellen. The coroner said the cabin had been abandoned since the late 1970s. Robert and Ellen Hayes moved out of River Hollow Road 2 weeks later. They never spoke about that night again. Not every storm just brings rain. Some bring memories, echoes of the lives that ended long before the thunder ever reached us. If you grew up in a small Midwestern town, you know the sound of a storm before it even starts. The air turns heavy, the wind picks up, and somewhere in the distance, a dog starts barking like it knows what's coming. Maple County was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. Folks went to work, came home, watched the weather, and prayed the power stayed on. But on a Thursday night in late April, everything changed. That was the night when the lights went out, and for a few of us, they never truly came back on. It started just after sunset. A line of black clouds rolled in over the cornfields, swallowing what little light was left in the sky. The wind howled through the trees, and rain came down in sheets so thick you could barely see past your headlights. The narrator, a lineman named Tom Richards, was home, drinking coffee from an old chipped mug when the call came through the radio, multiple outages reported across Maple County. He sighed, grabbed his raincoat, and stepped into the storm. For years, Tom had worked the grid, driving from one end of the county to the other during every kind of weather. But this storm felt heavier, not worse, just different. As he started the truck and pulled onto Route 12, lightning flashed, lighting up the empty fields like snapshots in time. By the time Tom reached the substation, the power grid was completely down. Every light, every home, every barn, dark. He radioed dispatch, but all he got back was static. Through the downpour, he could make out a faint glow in the distance. Not orange, not yellow, blue. A strange, cold blue that pulsed through the rain like the color of an old television screen. He drove closer, tires sliding on the wet pavement, until he reached Maple Street, the only road still lit in the entire county. House after house was glowing softly through the storm, their windows flickering like underwater lamps. Tom felt a knot tighten in his chest. He knew the power should have been gone everywhere. The grid didn't work in pieces like this. It was either all on or all off. But somehow, this street had found a way to stay alive in the dark. He parked the truck and stepped out, his boots sinking into puddles. The rain beat against his hard hat as he looked around, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then his radio hissed. At first, it was just more static, then a voice, faint and warped, "Don't look at the windows." Tom froze. He turned the volume down, thinking maybe he'd picked up interference from another crew, but the voice came again, clearer this time, whispering the same warning. He swallowed hard, scanning the houses. Curtains hung still. No movement. No shadows. Just that cold blue light. He told himself it had to be a malfunction, maybe a generator, maybe old wiring feeding back into the system. Still, something felt wrong. He walked up the nearest driveway, rain dripping off the brim of his hat. The front door was slightly open. Lightning flashed, and in that single burst of light, he saw them. People standing inside the glowing homes, completely still. Their faces were turned away, their bodies rigid, all facing the walls. He stepped back, breath quickening. Another flash of lightning, and he saw more of them, not moving, not reacting, just frozen in place. Every window showed the same scene, figures standing like statues, the blue light washing over their skin. The radio hissed again, louder now, filled with whispers that overlapped and echoed. He dropped it onto the wet ground. "Hello?" he shouted into the storm, but no one answered. The thunder rolled, and one by one, the lights began to fade. Within seconds, the entire street went black. Tom ran back to his truck, hands shaking as he turned the key. The engine coughed, then came alive. In the rearview mirror, the street was dark, except for one house. Its front window glowed for just a moment longer, revealing a figure standing in the doorway, watching him leave. By morning, the skies cleared. The county crews worked all day, restoring lines that had fallen during the storm. Tom returned to the office, still soaked, and told his supervisor what he'd seen. They checked the system logs, but there was no record of an outage. Every meter, every switch, every substation read normal. No power failure. No anomalies. Just a quiet night on paper. But Tom knew what he saw. A week later, he drove back down Maple Street during daylight. The houses were normal again. No glow. No movement. No sound. Yet when he looked at the power poles, he noticed something that made his stomach twist. None of the wires on that street were connected. If you've ever lived through an Oklahoma spring, you know that storms don't ask for permission. They come fast, loud, and without warning. The sirens start, the sky turns green, and all you can do is run for shelter and wait. For most folks, that shelter is the safest place you can be, a small, concrete box buried underground where the wind can't reach you. But for one woman in the small town of Elmore City, that storm shelter became something else entirely. It became a place she would never forget. Because when the wind started screaming that night, she realized she wasn't waiting out the storm alone. Her name was Margaret Allen, a 58-year-old widow who'd lived in Oklahoma all her life. She knew storms, she respected them. After her husband passed away 5 years earlier, she kept the storm shelter in perfect order, stocked with water, flashlights, and a small battery radio. It was a habit they'd shared, checking supplies before every spring season. That night, just before the tornado sirens began to howl, she was sitting at her kitchen table, watching the weather on TV. The weatherman's voice was calm but urgent. "If you're in the Elmore County area, take cover now." The thunder outside shook the windows. Margaret grabbed her jacket, her flashlight, and the small transistor radio, then made her way out back to the shelter. The wind tugged at her hair as she lifted the heavy metal door and climbed down the narrow steps. Inside, the air was cool and still, the faint smell of damp earth filling the space. She shut the door behind her, bolted it tight, and sat on the old wooden bench her husband had built years ago. The sound of the storm above was faint at first, then it began to roar, a long, low rumble that shook the walls like a passing freight train. Margaret took a deep breath. She'd been through dozens of storms before. This one, she told herself, would pass too. After about 20 minutes, the radio began to fade. The announcer's voice broke into static, cutting in and out until it went silent completely. Margaret tapped the side of it, thinking maybe the batteries had shifted, but it didn't come back on. She reached for her flashlight just as the shelter's single bulb flickered and went out. Darkness filled the space. She clicked on the flashlight, setting it beside her. The sound of the storm outside grew distant, then quiet, almost unnaturally so. That's when she heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from below her feet. At first, she thought it was her imagination, maybe the pipes expanding, or the soil shifting from all the rain. But then it came again. 3 slow knocks. Margaret froze. She leaned forward, shining her light at the floor, listening. The sound came again, faint, deliberate. It wasn't coming from the door or the walls. It was coming from directly under her, beneath the wooden boards. Her mouth went dry. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice trembling just a bit. But the only answer was the wind above, and that steady knocking, keeping its slow rhythm below her. Margaret tried to calm herself. Maybe it was a trapped animal. Maybe water had pooled and was dripping through the structure. She told herself anything she could to stay steady. But then she made a mistake. She spoke again. "Is anybody there?" she called out, louder this time. A pause followed, a long, empty pause. And then, in a soft voice that sounded exactly like hers, she heard the reply, "Is anybody there?" Her flashlight slipped from her hand, the beam rolling across the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest. She picked it up slowly, holding it tight. "Who's down there?" she whispered. The same voice came again, whispering the exact same words back, "Who's down there?" Each syllable matched her tone perfectly, even down to the slight crack in her voice. Margaret stumbled back, hitting the bench behind her. The voice was clearer now, not muffled, not distorted. It was as if she were listening to an echo that shouldn't exist. She clapped her hands over her mouth, terrified to speak again. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, until the voice whispered one last time, "Don't leave me here." Margaret's breathing grew shallow. She crouched down, pressing her ear to the cold floorboards. Beneath the shelter, something shifted, slow, scraping movements, like fingers brushing against wood. She backed away, shaking. Rain began to pour harder above, and thunder rolled like it was right overhead. The knocking started again, faster this time, urgent, like fists hitting from below. "Stop," she shouted, clutching the flashlight. But the knocking only grew louder. Then, without thinking, she reached for the pry bar hanging near the door, something her husband had left there in case the shelter door ever jammed. She wedged it under the floorboard seam and pushed. The wood groaned. Just enough of a gap opened for her to shine the flashlight inside. What she saw made her blood run cold. A hand, pale and thin, fingers trembling, reached up from the darkness below. And it wasn't just any hand. It was hers. The same freckles. The same gold ring she'd worn since her wedding day. The fingers stretched toward her light, reaching, shaking. Margaret screamed, dropping the flashlight. The light rolled across the floor as the shelter above shook violently, the wind howling louder than ever. The storm outside was in full force now, tearing through everything in its path. She slammed the floorboard shut, threw herself against the door, and prayed harder than she ever had in her life. When rescuers arrived the next morning, the storm had passed. The air was still and quiet, the sky a pale gray. They found the shelter door half open, its hinges bent from pressure. Margaret was inside, sitting on the bench, clutching her flashlight. She was alive, but shaken, her voice barely above a whisper. She told them she'd heard someone under the floor, but when they checked, there was nothing there, just packed earth and wet soil. As they led her out into the daylight, one of the rescuers noticed something strange. There were two sets of footprints inside the shelter, one leading in, one leading out. But Margaret had been alone the entire time. Some people say storms cleanse the earth, maybe they do. But sometimes, they wash up things that should have stayed hidden. Which of these stories chilled you the most tonight? Tell us below. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, we'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe, because more real-life horror stories are coming soon.